The courtroom was silent as Daniel Rigg, aged and frail, sat in handcuffs. No one noticed that his eyes were fixed not on the judge or the jury, but on something far more distant. The weight of years carried him quietly, as if none of it, this trial, this humiliation, could touch him. People whispered, some laughed, and one juror even rolled her eyes, but to Rigg, it all felt like a distant memory. He was just an old man now, forgotten, lost in time. But they didn't know who he really was. They didn't understand that the man in chains had once ended a war with a single, perfect shot. He sat motionless, the way only those who've waited too long for something can. His eyes weren't blank, they were watching ghosts. His uniform had long since been traded for discount store jackets and worn flannel, but there was something in his posture, unbending, precise, that hadn't aged. The judge shuffled papers and avoided his gaze. The prosecutor leaned into the jury, painting a portrait of a man disconnected from reality, dangerous in his unpredictability. Daniel didn't flinch. No family sat behind him. No supporters. Just a few bored locals, there for spectacle. A courtroom regular muttered, "He looks like he doesn't even care." But Daniel Rigg wasn't detached, he was remembering. Every corner of this room reminded him of something else, a sniper's nest in a shattered building, a radio call cut short, a target breathing his last breath across a sun-blasted rooftop. They'd summoned him to answer for a scuffle at a gas station. But what he carried to this courtroom wasn't guilt, it was the unbearable silence of being forgotten. And soon, the silence would break. Fallujah, 2004. The heat was thick, the kind that turned breath into steam and sweat into grime. Dust hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and every step crunched against broken stone and glass. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rigg moved with clinical calm, his rifle cradled in his arms like it was part of him. Around him, younger Marines shouted orders, took cover, fired wildly into the haze. But not Rigg. He waited. He watched. He'd been assigned to overwatch Point Echo, a half-collapsed apartment complex with a line of sight on the main road where the insurgents were rumored to move weapons and men. His spotter had taken shrapnel that morning, nothing fatal, but enough to leave Rigg alone. Alone suited him fine. His mind operated differently from others. He didn't get rattled. Didn't shake. Didn't need backup. He was the backup. At 0900 hours, everything changed. A convoy led by General Samuel Wyatt was ambushed 2 blocks away. RPGs slammed into the first vehicle, sending fire and limbs into the air. The radio crackled with chaos. "We're pinned," requesting immediate support. Rigg didn't wait for orders. He switched to his long-range scope and scanned the chaos unfolding below. 7 hostiles. 4 RPGs. A child acting as a spotter on the rooftop across the road. Rigg took the shot. 1 down. Pivot. Second shot, another down. He didn't count kills. He counted threats neutralized. He moved like time didn't touch him. His finger pressed the trigger with no more emotion than someone switching off a light. On the ground, Wyatt's men began to move. Rigg guided them from afar. Enemy at the corner? Gone. Sniper 2 rooftops over? Gone. They never even saw the bullet. The enemy started retreating, but Rigg didn't let them run. Not this time. He followed them through broken walls and alleys with his scope, picking off leaders, scattering them like insects under sudden light. By the time backup arrived, the ambush had dissolved into bodies and retreating shadows. Wyatt's convoy limped through the ruins. The general stepped out, helmet cracked, blood running down his cheek. He looked up at the balcony where Rigg had set up. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly who had turned the tide. Later that night, Wyatt requested to meet the sniper. Rigg declined. "I'm not in this for handshakes," he said. The general sent him a bottle of bourbon and a note, when the world forgets you, I won't." Rigg tucked the note into his pocket and went back to work. The war didn't end with that day, of course. There were more cities. More firefights. More missions that weren't supposed to succeed, but did. Rigg's name became whispered legend among those who served with him. He didn't need medals, though he got them. He didn't want interviews, though the Corps asked. What mattered to him wasn't glory. It was doing his job. And he was very, very good at it. But the world doesn't always know what to do with men like Daniel Rigg when the wars are over. He left the military in 2007, his retirement marked by a short ceremony attended by a handful of officers and enlisted men who understood what he meant to them. The Corps offered him security gigs, tactical consulting, even overseas private contracts that promised six-figure salaries. He turned them all down. He bought a used pickup truck and drove south until he found a town no one would think to ask about him in. Quiet, flat, mostly forgotten. He rented a small house outside the city line. Nothing fancy. One bedroom, cracked concrete driveway, American flag faded on the porch. He didn't unpack most of his boxes. Just his rifle, which he locked in a case under the bed, and the note from General Wyatt, which he pinned behind the medicine cabinet mirror. For years, he kept to himself. He walked the back roads at sunrise. He spoke only when necessary. Kids thought he was strange. Adults said he was a loner. He didn't mind. He paid his taxes, nodded to the mailman, helped one neighbor fix her fence in silence, then never mentioned it again. But time is cruel to men who once mattered. His knees began to ache. His hands trembled a bit in the cold. The VA clinic was a 2-hour drive away, and the staff changed so often, none of them knew who he was or what he'd done. Sometimes they got his records wrong. Once they labeled him as unstable, prone to isolation. He laughed at that. Not because it was wrong, but because it was the first time someone had noticed at all. The incident at the gas station was minor, really. A clerk accused him of trying to steal a can of coffee. Rigg insisted he'd paid, even held up the receipt. But when the young man behind the counter raised his voice and reached for his phone, something inside Rigg snapped, not with anger, but with weariness. He didn't shout. Didn't threaten. Just stared with such intensity that the boy stumbled backward and hit the silent alarm. The cops came fast. They found the receipt still warm from the printer. But it didn't matter. He'd intimidated a civilian. He'd refused to cooperate. He resisted arrest by simply walking out the door. So they cuffed him, pressed him into the asphalt, and hauled him away like a drunk from a bar fight. He didn't fight. He didn't even speak. In the holding cell, he waited. Not for a lawyer. Not for an apology. But for silence. That familiar companion. They didn't see a Marine. They saw an old man in flannel. The bruises on his wrists healed. The arrest record wouldn't. The court date was set. And when he arrived that day in the same boots he wore into Fallujah, no one recognized him. No one, that is, until someone far away saw his name in a local paper, printed small under the crime blotter section. And began making plans to visit. The town of Harper's Hollow prided itself on being safe, quiet, and unremarkable. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted to escape headlines, not make them. That's why the small article about Daniel Rigg's arrest caused such an oddly disproportionate stir. In a town where the biggest controversy in a decade was the high school principal's DUI, a story about a hostile elderly man threatening a gas station clerk became unexpected gossip fodder. What no one seemed to notice, or care to explore, was how much didn't add up. The receipt with the timestamp. The fact that Rigg never raised his voice. The convenience store's lack of surveillance footage. The quiet mutter from one of the arresting officers who later confided to his girlfriend, "Guy looked at me like he was measuring wind speed." But the town wasn't interested in nuance. Rigg had always been a curiosity. Now, they had a reason to fear him. It didn't help that the prosecutor assigned to the case was looking to build a reputation. A fresh-faced former law clerk named Timothy Brandt, only 3 years out of law school and hungry for headlines. This was his first solo case in front of a jury, and he wanted it clean and decisive. He saw Daniel Rigg not as a man but a symbol, a test case for showing the town that no one, not even some retired war vet, was above the law. So Brandt built a narrative. He brought in character witnesses who knew Rigg only from a distance, the clerk who called him cold, a neighbor who complained he never returned greetings, a cashier from the local grocery store who described him as weird, always watching people. No one had ever seen him act violently, but Brandt didn't need that. All he needed was discomfort. Unease. Suspicion. A dangerous loner in a post-9/11 America. The media didn't help. Harper's Hollow had one newspaper and a local cable access news station, and both leaned on sensationalism when viewership dipped. Rigg's mugshot was published next to a blurry photo of him in a camouflage jacket, walking stiffly across a parking lot. The caption read, "Veteran or threat?" The article beneath it quoted unnamed sources and referred vaguely to his troubled past and military trauma. That was enough for most readers. In small towns, nuance dies quickly, strangled by the need for closure. In the week leading up to the trial, Rigg said nothing. His court-appointed attorney, Margaret Dean, tried to prepare a defense, but her client wouldn't engage. He sat in her office with his hands folded and his gaze far away. "You need to let me help you," she pleaded. "They think you're dangerous, Daniel. If you don't speak, if you don't explain." He shook his head once, and that was the end of it. She didn't know what to do with him. Dean wasn't a bad lawyer, she just wasn't used to men like Rigg. Men who measured every word as though each cost a piece of themselves. He wasn't combative. He wasn't rude. He just didn't offer anything. She tried researching his service record but most of it was redacted. What little she found left her stunned. Silver Star. Navy Cross. 2 Purple Hearts. A mention in a Marine Corps after-action report that credited an unnamed sniper with preventing a catastrophic casualty event in 2004. But none of that would be admissible unless she could tie it to character, and Rigg wouldn't give her a single word to work with. The morning of the trial, the courthouse buzzed with anticipation. Reporters set up outside like it was a celebrity hearing. Inside, townspeople filled the seats, curious to see the spectacle. Rigg entered wearing a clean button-up shirt, tucked in, hair combed. He looked older than ever, but his posture was military. Upright. Unflinching. The same clerk who had filed the complaint stared daggers at him from across the aisle, flanked by 2 police officers and his mother. Jury selection had already been completed. 6 women, 6 men. A cross-section of Harper's Hollow, none of whom had served in the military, none of whom knew Daniel Rigg beyond the curated image fed to them over the last 2 weeks. The judge, a weary woman named Anne-Marie Blake, had seen her fair share of petty cases and big egos. This one struck her differently, though she couldn't say why. Opening statements were short. Brandt painted a portrait of a reclusive man incapable of adjusting to civilian life, a man so far gone into paranoia and rigidity that a minor dispute over a cup of coffee escalated into what he called a credible threat. Dean, true to her client's wishes, said almost nothing. "We ask only that you consider not who Mr. Rigg appears to be, but who he truly is. That may take more than a glance." Witnesses came and went. Some contradicted each other. A few admitted they never actually saw the event. But the more Brandt repeated the phrase, military trauma, the more the jurors leaned forward. The media fed the frenzy, updating the case live online. A local op-ed ran the headline, "Hero turned head case." At no point did Rigg speak. The judge asked if he wanted to testify. He declined. Dean begged him to let her bring up his service. He refused. "They won't believe it," he said. "Not from me." She tried to explain that wasn't the point, that the jury needed a reason to doubt the story Brant was feeding them. Rigg only said, "They made up their minds already. I've seen that look before." And then came the moment no one expected. Outside, an unmarked black car pulled up. A man in uniform stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, moving with the precise confidence of someone who'd worn medals heavier than most would ever understand. His driver tried to open the door for him. The man waved him off. General Samuel Wyatt was not a man who attended local trials. But he had flown across the country with one purpose. The moment he saw Rigg's name in that paper, he called in a favor, contacted the judge directly, and quietly arranged a seat in the back of the courtroom. No announcement. No spectacle. Just presence. He walked into the courtroom unannounced as the prosecutor prepared his next argument. The air shifted. Heads turned. The clerk dropped his water bottle. Margaret Dean's jaw fell open. But it was Daniel Rigg who didn't move at all. He just blinked once, the faintest ghost of surprise flickering behind his tired eyes. General Wyatt took his seat in silence, folding his hands neatly in front of him. He didn't need to say a word. Not yet. General Samuel Wyatt didn't need a badge or a summons to command attention. He sat in the back row, uniform crisp, ribbons glinting softly beneath the courtroom lights. He didn't speak. Didn't raise a hand. But his presence changed the atmosphere instantly. For a moment, the room forgot the trial, forgot the accusations, forgot everything except the silent weight of a man who had no business being there unless something monumental was about to happen. Brant faltered. The prosecutor stammered mid-sentence, his rhythm broken. He tried to recover, but his voice cracked just slightly as he continued his argument to the jury. He threw sideways glances toward the back, trying to act unaffected, but sweat had formed at his collar. He didn't know who the man was, not yet. But he could tell, instinctively, that someone with power had entered the room. And that someone wasn't here for him. Judge Blake noticed too. Her eyes narrowed with recognition. It wasn't just that Wyatt was decorated, it was which decorations adorned his chest. You don't sit on the bench for 20 years without learning to read uniforms. She saw the 4 stars, the Defense Distinguished Service Medal, the Combat Infantryman Badge, and, impossibly, the rare, sacred blue of the Medal of Honor. Still, Wyatt remained seated. Dean turned in her chair, stunned. She leaned toward Daniel, whispering sharply, "You know him?" Rigg gave a near-invisible nod. "He's not here for them." "Is he here for you?" Another nod. Nothing else. The trial continued, but it had lost its pulse. The jury's attention shifted, even those trying to stay objective now watched Wyatt instead of the witness stand. The court resumed with a store clerk giving a lukewarm description of events, fumbling with dates and timelines. Brant paced nervously, trying to pull meaning out of shallow testimony. No one was listening. Wyatt stood. The entire courtroom turned to him. Even the judge seemed to brace herself. "Your Honor," he said, voice deep and steady. "I apologize for the interruption, but I would like to request permission to address the court." Brant immediately objected. "He isn't on the witness list. This is highly irregular." But Blake held up her hand. "State your name and relation to the case." "General Samuel Wyatt, United States Army, retired. I am here on behalf of Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Rigg, United States Marine Corps, retired." A collective hush swept through the room. The silence was deeper than before, expectant, reverent. Brant protested again. "This is inappropriate. There are channels." "Sit down, Mr. Brant," Judge Blake said, her voice firmer than it had been all day. "The court will hear the general." Wyatt walked slowly to the witness stand. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need to. He took the oath, sat down, and looked directly at the jury. Then at Rigg. I am not here because someone asked me to be. I am here because I owe my life to that man sitting at the defense table. 31 years ago, my convoy was ambushed in Fallujah. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. Most of the men I led were fresh out of boot camp. They didn't know fear yet, but they would have learned it the hard way. And they would have died. He paused. Looked at the jurors. Except they didn't. Because Sergeant Rigg was there. On his own initiative, he neutralized the threat from over 800 meters away. One by one. With surgical precision. He saved my life. He saved 37 other lives that day. You don't need to take my word for it. The Department of Defense awarded him multiple commendations for his actions. What you do need to understand is that he never once asked for anything in return. He didn't want recognition. He refused interviews. He didn't even attend the medal ceremonies. That's who he is. Brant tried to object again, citing relevance, but Judge Blake silenced him with a single look. Wyatt leaned in slightly. And now, here we are. A man like that, brought into court over a misunderstanding and treated like a criminal. I know this system. I respect it. But I also know that sometimes, justice forgets its memory. And when that happens, good men fall through the cracks. He turned to the judge. I flew here today because I read a newspaper article. A single paragraph buried between advertisements. That's what his name has become. An afterthought. That is unacceptable. Then he looked to the jury again. You see a man who won't defend himself. That's because he's tired. Not of the law. Not of this town. He's tired of being misunderstood. Of carrying the weight of the people he couldn't save. Of waking up every day and pretending it all meant nothing. I came here today to remind you that it did mean something. That he does. He stood. This man is a hero. Not just mine. He's yours, whether you know it or not. A heavy pause. No one moved. Even Brant stood stunned, mouth open, hands useless at his sides. He wasn't trained to argue against legends. Wyatt returned to his seat. Rigg didn't speak. His face remained unreadable, but for a long moment, his eyes locked with Wyatt's, and something passed between them. Not gratitude, something deeper. Brotherhood. Margaret Dean cleared her throat and stood slowly. Your Honor, I move to dismiss. Brant objected, but his voice was too late, too soft. Judge Blake didn't respond right away. She stared at Rigg, her brow furrowed, weighing what she had heard. Finally, she said, I'll take the motion under advisement. The jury was dismissed for the day, but no one left right away. The room stayed full, thick with something unspoken. Even the bailiff didn't bark the usual orders. People shuffled out slowly, glancing over their shoulders at the still silent figure of Daniel Rigg, who remained seated. Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had begun to gather. Veterans from nearby towns had heard. Some had driven hours. They didn't shout. They didn't carry signs. They stood in formation, back straight, medals on jackets, hands behind their backs. Silent. Like a guard of honor waiting to reclaim one of their own. Inside, Rigg finally stood, legs stiff, back still unnaturally straight. He didn't speak to Dean. Didn't speak to Wyatt. He simply nodded. And for the first time since his arrest, he allowed himself to exhale. The storm hadn't passed. But the silence had changed. Now, it spoke for him. The morning of the verdict began differently. There were no whispers. No laughter. No sideways glances. The gallery was filled to capacity, locals, veterans, reporters, a few unfamiliar faces in sharp suits clearly sent from faraway offices. The courthouse doors had barely opened when the crowd began to form, and by the time Judge Blake took the bench, it was standing room only. A stillness hung in the air, not unlike the tense quiet before a battle. Daniel Rigg sat alone at the defense table. No chains this time. He wore the same clean shirt, tucked into the same faded pants. He hadn't shaved. He hadn't smiled. But something in his face was different now, not defiant, not hopeful, just present. General Wyatt returned to his seat in the back row, dressed in civilian attire this time. No medals, no uniform, but the respect he commanded hadn't dimmed. He nodded once to Rigg, who acknowledged it with the barest of movements. Judge Blake addressed the courtroom. Before we proceed with closing statements, I would like to allow a final voluntary witness to speak. This court recognizes Colonel Marcus Eddings, United States Marine Corps, retired. Gasps spread through the room. Another name. Another ghost from the life Rigg had never spoken of. A tall, lean man with silver hair and an angular face rose from the second row. He wore a brown sport coat and moved with a limp that echoed old wounds. He approached the stand and took the oath with quiet grace. His eyes, when they met the jury's, were calm and deliberate. I commanded Daniel Rigg during 2 deployments. Iraq. Afghanistan. In both, he was the constant in chaos. Men rotated, command changed, everything shifted, except Rigg. He didn't just shoot. He didn't just follow orders. He kept people alive. Brandt, looking pale, leaned forward to object, but Blake silenced him with a simple, "Let him speak." Eddings continued. "I'll give you one story. During a night operation outside of Kandahar, we were ambushed while moving through a mountain pass. No moonlight. Visibility was 0. Rigg climbed 30 meters up a ridge, alone, to spot the snipers pinning us down. He took out 6 in less than 90 seconds, including one who had my head in his scope. We didn't know he'd done it until morning. He didn't even mention it in his report. He looked toward Rigg. We had to read about it in the logs." Eddings turned back to the jury. "I don't know what happened at that gas station. I won't pretend to. But I know this, if Daniel Rigg had wanted to hurt someone, there wouldn't have been an arrest. There would have been an obituary." That sentence echoed like a gunshot. He stepped down, nodded to Wyatt, and returned to his seat. Margaret Dean stood, blinking away the weight of what had just unfolded. Her voice, quiet at first, rose with conviction. "You've seen the prosecution's story, a recluse, a threat, someone who refused to speak. But now you've seen the truth. A man who's seen things none of us could imagine. Who protected people, again and again, and asked for nothing. The same man who sat here, never demanding your understanding, because he didn't expect it. Because he's used to being forgotten." She paused, letting the words settle. "If silence is his shield, it's not because he's dangerous. It's because silence is all he's been given in return." Brandt didn't even rise. His closing statement had been written for a different trial. One without legends. Without history. His words fell flat, redundant, unconvincing. The jury deliberated for less than 30 minutes. When they returned, none of them could meet Rigg's eyes at first. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with crow's feet and clasped hands, read the verdict with a shaky voice. On the charge of intimidation, not guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, not guilty. On the charge of public disturbance, not guilty. A breathless silence followed. Then, murmurs. Then, quiet applause, immediately hushed by the bailiff but not before the moment bloomed. Judge Blake cleared her throat. "Mr. Rigg, you are free to go. These charges are dismissed and will be expunged." Rigg didn't move. Dean turned to him. "Daniel? You can stand now." But he remained seated for a long beat, as if waiting for something else. Then, slowly, he stood, knees stiff, eyes forward. Wyatt rose with him. So did Eddings. So did half the room. One by one, veterans in uniform and civilians alike followed. It wasn't a standing ovation. It wasn't celebration. It was respect, quiet, solemn, earned. Outside, the veterans who had gathered information began to shift. Some removed their hats. Some saluted. One man, missing both legs, sat in a wheelchair with his hand to his heart. Rigg stepped into the daylight with the sun high above him, casting long shadows down the courthouse steps. He paused at the top, unsure what to do with the sudden stillness around him. He had spent so many years alone that this, being seen, felt like foreign territory. General Wyatt approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said. "Not the memories. But this part." Rigg looked out over the parking lot. "I never asked for this." "I know," Wyatt replied. "That's why it matters." Reporters swarmed the steps, but no one shoved a microphone in his face. They knew better. Instead, one young journalist, no older than a recruit, quietly asked, "Sir, what would you like people to know?" Rigg didn't answer right away. Then, after a long pause, he spoke for the first time in public since the trial began. "I didn't come here to be remembered. I came here because I was forgotten." That quote would appear on front pages the next day. And for once, the story wouldn't be buried beneath ads or sports scores. It would lead. Daniel Rigg didn't return to his house that day. He was invited to speak at the VFW, but declined. He sat with Wyatt and Eddings at a diner on the edge of town, ordered black coffee, and said nothing for half an hour. When the waitress asked if he wanted cream, he looked at her like she'd asked if he wanted to change history. "I'm fine," he said. Later that night, alone in the motel he checked into, he unpacked one item from his duffel, the bourbon Wyatt had sent him years ago. The seal was still intact. He poured a glass, sat on the edge of the bed, and watched the sun go down over a parking lot filled with fading echoes of a trial that had finally said what he never could. He didn't toast. He didn't speak. He just drank in silence. But this time, he wasn't alone in it. The morning after the trial, the town of Harper's Hollow woke up differently. Something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. There were no parades, no declarations, no fireworks. Just quiet gestures that echoed louder than applause ever could. The clerk from the gas station was seen taking down the "No Loitering" sign from the window. The local paper retracted its earlier article and published a full-page editorial titled, "We Were Wrong." Veterans' flags went back up across porches. People no longer looked away when they passed Daniel Rigg's old rental house. They paused, stood still, maybe even saluted. But Rigg wasn't there. He didn't go home that night, nor the next. Instead, he disappeared, quietly, the way men like him always do when their business with the world is concluded. He left behind no note, no address. Margaret Dean found an envelope under her office door with only her name on the front and, inside, the bourbon label from the bottle he'd opened with Wyatt. Taped to it was a scrap of yellow legal paper with one sentence in clean block letters, "You listened." That was enough. A week passed. Then another. General Wyatt received a package at his Virginia residence. No return address. Inside was Rigg's service rifle, cleaned, oiled, the scope replaced with a note etched on its side, "Not needed anymore." Wyatt held the weapon like a relic, reverently. He set it in a glass case beside his own awards and stared at it for hours. Meanwhile, something was building, something no one quite expected. A clip from the trial, posted by a local journalist, had gone viral. Not the verdict. Not the moment Wyatt spoke. Just 30 seconds of silence when Rigg stood, stoic, as the jury cleared his name. Millions viewed it. commented, shared. Some said they saw a ghost of their own father in that man. Others said nothing at all, just posted his name. Daniel Rigg. Again and again. The algorithm couldn't explain it. The internet couldn't categorize it. But people felt it. And from feeling came action. Letters began arriving in Harper's Hollow. At first, a few. Then dozens. Then hundreds. Most addressed to Daniel Rigg, care of Town Hall, the courthouse, the diner where he once sat. They came from retired soldiers, grieving parents, medics, chaplains, even foreign allies who had once fought alongside American forces. Stories spilled out, stories of men and women Rigg had never met but who felt they knew him, because they had been him. One letter read, "I watched that silence, and it was louder than any speech. You carried what we all carry, and you didn't ask to be saved. But you reminded us that maybe we could be." Eventually, someone started a petition to name the town's old armory building after him. Within 3 days, over 50,000 signatures. The mayor, initially indifferent to the trial, now found herself on national news. She gave a strained interview. Mr. Rigg was clearly misunderstood. Our community is working to ensure veterans like him are recognized. But none of it reached him. Not directly. Wyatt tried. He called in favors. Traced addresses. Sent messages through every channel he had. Eddings checked old Marine networks. Dean drove to every motel in the county. But Daniel Rigg was nowhere to be found. Until the day a delivery truck pulled into the VA Medical Center in Asheville, North Carolina. A tall man with a lean frame stepped down from the passenger side, wearing jeans, a black t-shirt, and a pair of old Marine boots. His hair was longer. His beard fuller. But his eyes, gray, sharp, haunted, were unmistakable. He approached the admissions desk and quietly said, "I'd like to volunteer." The receptionist blinked. "Sir? You mean, to work here?" "Yeah. Not as a doctor. Not as staff. Just, help." "Help how?" "However they need." Word spread slowly. Then quickly. Rigg began showing up every morning before sunrise. He cleaned wheelchairs. Delivered coffee to patients. Sat with amputees during physical therapy. Never said much. Just enough. The VA staff didn't question him. The residents trusted him instinctively. One therapist, Jessica Nguyen, noticed something else. The ones who didn't talk to anyone, they talked to him. "I don't know why. He doesn't do anything special. He just sits." But they open up. One night, a young Marine named Luis Estrada suffered a breakdown. Screaming, shaking, punching walls. Nothing helped. Doctors sedated him. The next day, he wouldn't speak. Until Rigg walked into his room and just sat. No words. No orders. Just presence. After 20 minutes, Estrada whispered, "You ever shoot someone you didn't want to?" Rigg didn't flinch. "Yeah," he said. Estrada cried. It happened again. And again. Others began calling Rigg the quiet sergeant. He never corrected them. A local journalist eventually tracked him down and asked for a comment. "I'm not here for a story," Rigg replied. "What are you here for, then?" Rigg looked out the window. Sunlight filtered through pine trees. He thought for a moment. To make silence useful. The piece went viral. Again. But Rigg didn't change. He didn't step into a spotlight. He didn't do interviews. He just kept showing up. Then came the ceremony. The town of Harper's Hollow, flooded with letters and attention, had followed through. The old armory was renamed the Daniel Rigg Veteran Center. A bronze plaque was cast with the inscription, "For the ones who were never asked to speak, but bore everything in silence." They held the dedication without him. But during the speech, General Wyatt paused, looked out into the crowd. And there, at the edge of the crowd beneath a tree, stood Rig. Not in uniform. Not giving a speech. Just watching. Wyatt didn't wave. Rig didn't nod. But their eyes met across that field of strangers, and everything that had needed to be said had already been said. Afterward, Rig slipped away, unnoticed by most. Just as he always had. But for the first time, the silence didn't swallow him. This time, it followed him like a shadow of recognition, not applause, not pity, but truth. And it stayed. Finally seen.